lectures, we were talking about reactions where we had, for example, compound A, reactant A, whatever this is, and this is consumed. And we could write, for example, the general rate equation, dA over dt equals, and because it's consumption, we can write it as minus K times concentration of A to the power of 1 if it was a first order kinetics. And we said when we plot this, so here we've got the concentration of A and here we have time. What we will see for a first order reaction is usually something like that. Yeah? And this point here was, we called this, bless you, we call this A0. That's our starting concentration of A. So far, so good. We also came up with an equation to describe this curve and this first order reaction, where we said AT at a certain time equals, what do I have to write? A0 times E to the power of minus K times TT minus T0. Exactly. And that basically describes this reaction. Now, very often we have the situation that this A that is consumed is producing something. So, for example, when I eat these sweets, it will have an impact on me, right? So it will go like that. So this A is, we can say, is converted to B. Now, if I'm not interested in the consumption of A, but I'm interested in the generation of B, obviously, I need to do something. Now, how would our curve look like if I tried to depict the generation of B in this particular curve here? What would that look like? Well, at the beginning, at the very start, how much do I have? 0. Exactly. So I would start from here, and it would be a curve like that. Yeah? Does that make sense? So that's B, and this one is A. How much B can I maximum get? How much B can I get? Sorry? I can. Did you hear that? Probably not. Loud.
As much as A as you have.
I can only get as much B as I have A0. Yeah? So that's here sort of the limitation. B at any time has to be smaller or equal to A0. It can't get any higher. I guess that makes sense, doesn't it? We can also say, actually, let's take any kind of time, let's say we have this time here. That's our time. We can say AT plus BT, that means A at that time and B at that particular time, equals, what does that? A0, exactly. So at any time, if we put the two together, A and B, we get our maximum number, our A0, what we had at the beginning. So can we come up with an equation that describes the production of this B? So it would start with BT equals, well, first of all, let's rearrange this equation here. And we can say BT equals A0 minus AT. No, it's just rearranging. Now, I0, I know. Do I know AT? Look at what I have here. I have an equation that describes AT. So I can say BT equals A0 minus A0 e to the power of minus k times the t's. Make sense? And of course, I can write this equation a little bit nicer. And I can say BT equals A0 1 minus E minus K TT. Yeah? Let me write this on the next page again, because we have a look at what this actually implies. And we can check this equation, whether it's correct, hopefully. BT equals A0, 1 minus E minus K. And here I just write T, because I'm lazy. Right. Let's also have our graph again. So that's A. And that's B. Let's play around a little bit with this equation. What happens, bless you, if T, so T is very large? What would happen to T? So we have a large T here. And T large obviously means in this region here. So T is big. What does that mean for this term here? Loud? It would be very small, because e to the power of minus something very big is something very small. Yeah? So this is small. What happens to 1, to this expression here? To 1 minus e to the power of minus big. What would that give us? It would be very close to 1, exactly. Yeah? 1 minus something very small is still close to 1. So what happens to BT? So BT, you are absolutely right, BT will be close to A0. Perfectly right. What would happen if T, let me use a different color, if T is very small? Minus K times something very small. Let's put in 0, yeah? What happens if T is 0? My e to the power of minus kt becomes sorry? E, if t is 0, what is 0 times k? 0. What is e to the power of 0? 1. Aha. So what is 1 minus 1? 0. What is A0 times 0? 0. So in this case, BT equals 0. Yeah? You see, our predictions were absolutely right. If t is very small, we have no BT. If t is large, our B tends towards A0. This is actually quite a good trick, how you can check out whether your equations, when you develop some equations, when you develop equations, you can check what happens if I make one of the parameters very big or one very small. Yeah? You've probably done that in kinetics, in enzymes, have you? What happens when you make your substrate concentration very, very big? What happens to the Michaelis-Menten equation? Well, the Km becomes negligible, and you have Vmax times S divided by S. You can cancel out the S, and the rate equals Vmax. Yeah? So that tells you what's going on when you make the substrate concentration extremely big. Does that make sense to you guys? Yeah? So, this was basically the case when we had this situation here. A is converted into B. And for each A, we get one B, and we assume that this is a first-order reaction. It works with all the other reactions as well. So it's not just for first-order reaction. And the important thing is, our B is really limited by how much A we have. Okay? Now, let's take a different scenario. Let's assume we have two rabbits. Okay, my artistic skills are slightly limited, but you get the gist, right? There should be rabbits. Now, of course, rabbits do what rabbits do. And if you've got two rabbits of the right gender, you will get more rabbits. And more rabbits. And more rabbits. So we don't have a situation where something is consumed. We just have something that where rabbits are produced. So in a way, we've got a scenario like that. Yeah? Rabbits are produced. So the two rabbits will have baby rabbits. Baby rabbits grow up. Baby rabbits are no longer baby rabbits. They are adult rabbits. And the adult rabbits, they have, again, baby rabbits and so on and so forth. This is actually how we were told that humankind was brought into existence. There was Adam and Eve, and there was a snake, and there was an apple, and things like that. Have you ever looked at paintings depicting Adam and Eve? Yeah, you have. Have you noticed something really interesting? They have belly buttons. Why is that interesting? They shouldn't have belly buttons, right? Because a belly button indicates that you were in a womb. But if they were the first two people, then it makes you scratch your head. And then, of course, if they were the first two people, they had two sons, Abel and Cain, and one shot the other one, or was it just killed or something like that? And then it says that the survivor went away to a different country. We are not getting told what happened to that guy. Obviously, he must have died very lonely because there was nobody else. But then the Bible is sort of, we are not entirely sure what happens. I'm just saying that because, I'm not dissing any religious beliefs. I want to point that out. It's just some things that make you think about these issues there. Anyway, the rabbits produce more rabbits. So how would that look like actually in our curve? So it would be an exponential growth curve. It would be something like that. So this is an exponential growth. And this was sort of formulated and discovered by a Dutch scientist called Malthus. It's the Malthus exponential growth curve. How are we going to write this in mathematical terms? Well, we can say, in this case, we are looking at the change in B over time. And because we are looking at the production, which is not restricted by anything by consumption. We are looking at this production, and therefore it is plus. Remember, production means plus. K times B to the power of, let's say, 1. Yep. And this actually gives us exactly a curve like that. Now, of course, you can imagine that if we didn't stop the rabbits, disaster will strike. The planet will be overrun by rabbits. Somebody calculated that after, I don't know how many, 50, 60, or maybe even 70 generations of rabbits, the planet would double in mass. So we would have as many rabbits as Earth weighs. It's a little bit, unless you like to eat rabbit. Do you know that when people have rabbits as pets, do you know what their favorite name for the rabbit is? Peter. No. It's actually Stuart. Rabbit stew. Ow. That was a really bad one. I'm sorry. I apologize. Right. So this exponential growth obviously can't go on forever. And therefore, people said, right, that there is something not right when we want to describe some kind of biological, natural occurrence with that. So therefore, they came up with a slightly modified version. And they said, okay, dB over dt equals, and this is something where I'm not terribly happy with the nomenclature of things, because this then was developed by people who were ecologists. They just simply said, okay, instead of this little k for constant, we call it rate constant. And therefore, they introduced the letter R. And that's, here I should say, that's the rate constant. And I said, obviously, it depends on the number of rabbits that we have. We have to have at least 2. If we only have 1 rabbit, then it will die lonely. And I don't know why I did that. So concentration of B of rabbits to the power of 1. So far, this is exactly our exponential growth. But I said, this rate actually depends on other things. This rate does not stay constant. And they introduced some factors. And they said this rate varies, and the variation is 1 minus b over another thing called k. This k actually is not a rate constant, and that's why I'm terribly unhappy about this. This k is actually called the carrying capacity. You're absolutely right, Anton. And the result of this one here, you can differentiate that. It gives you hell of a complicated curve, a hell of a complicated equation. But basically what this does is if you look at B versus time, it gives you a sigmoidal curve. Yeah? And this K here, that is this bit here, that is the carrying capacity of the system. And this equation was developed by a guy called Verhulst. It's also known as logistic growth. And what you will find is that whatever system you look at, for example, bacterial growth, you will find pretty much something like a logistic growth curve. So this region here, where apparently not a lot happens, but it does happen, is called the lag phase. This phase here, that's the exponential phase, exactly. And this phase here, typically, is the stationary phase. And very often what you see then is something like that. It's the death phase. Yeah? But that's not included in the Verhulst equation. Right. Let's have a look at what this equation actually tells us. So I'll write that down again. dB over dt equals R times 1 minus B over K times B to the power of 1. Now, let's have a look at this B over K, at this ratio here. Let's say our population B is much, much smaller than this K. Bless you. Yeah? B is much, much smaller. So we have only a few rabbits, and the carrying capacity is, say, 500,000 rabbits. What will happen? So B over K, is this big or small? It's very small, because we've got something small divided by something very big. So B over K is small. 1 minus B over K will be close to 1. So therefore we have R B to the power of 1. What's that? That is exponential growth. So if the population of rabbits or humans or insects is far away from the capacity, we will see exponential growth. What will happen when B equals K? What's happening then? What happens to B over K? Equals 1. What happens to 1 minus B over K? Equals 0. So what we then have is B dB over dt equals 0 times b to the power of 1. What's that? It's 0. Yeah? So when the population of rabbits reaches the capacity, the growth is stopped. They are no longer growing, the population. So dB over dt equals R1 b over k, b to the power of 1. What happens, what happens if b is larger than k? What happens to b over k? What happens to b over k? b over k is larger than 1, isn't it? So what happens to 1 minus b over k? It becomes negative. Yeah? So then we have dB over dt equals negative R b to the power of 1. What is that? That is a consumption. That's interesting. Because what would happen is, if we plot our graph again, b and time, let's say here is our k. What happens is that if by any chance we overshoot like that, if that happens through some weird incident, it would have something like that. It overshoots, we have a consumption, it needs to go down. Very often we'll see an undershoot in this case. It goes up, wobbles around a little bit, but eventually it will reach this K, this equilibrium. And in terms of biological systems, this is where the population then will be stable. So stable population at the carrying capacity. Right, quick question. For humans, what is the carrying capacity? 8 billion? Mm-hmm. Any other? Aha, say loud. So, that's a very, very interesting point. The answer to my question is, so far nobody knows what the carrying capacity is for humans. Some people believe it's probably around 12 to 15 billion. So we are still in a position where we can actually grow. Yeah, so we might be in that range. Some people believe that the carrying capacity for sustainable life on this planet is maybe around 5 to 6 billion. Now we are already 7 billion. That means we are already in this overshoot area. And as a consequence, something drastic will happen and the population has to go down again. Nobody knows where we are. But what is very clear is that at one point, any kind of organism will reach its carrying capacity. That's very clear. There's no way around. Now, humans are very smart, and they have the ability of moving the carrying capacity. So, for example, through innovations in biotechnology, through innovations in engineering, there is a potential for shifting this capacity from, let's say, 10 billion to 15 billion. If we, for example, produce enough food, if we manage to produce enough water, so there is a potential for humans because we have it more or less in our own hand. We can, of course, try to not that quickly reach the capacity. How could we do that? Sorry? Second? Stop having children. That's a very, very good thing. What is the implication if you have no children?
Probably means that the aging population will increase, so there will be no ability to grow the population in the long term.
Okay. So if we combine both things, what we can do is, of course, we can try to take this R and try to get this down. Yeah? So our rate constant with which we grow becomes smaller and smaller. Of course, the knock-on effect is that we have an aging population then. And if our our entire society is based on growth, you're snookered. Yeah? Now, in many so-called industrialized countries, this is already the case that R is going down. The growth rate in the population is going down. People have less children, and therefore, in some countries, R is already negative. So there are less births than there are deaths. The population is going down. In other countries, this is not the case. So the last time I checked, which was a few years ago, I have to admit, there are certain countries which have a growth rate of up to 2.5%. So every year, their population grows by 2.5%. Now here is actually an interesting dilemma and an interesting strategy. And this applies again to all biological systems. We can have, in terms of the growth of a population, we can have organisms that are either R strategists or K strategists. Now, R strategists are organisms that reproduce very, very quickly. So their rate would be like something like that, where they reproduce like mad. K strategists, on the other hand, would be like something like that, where the growth curve looks like that. Can you imagine scenarios where an R strategy is useful for a species? Pioneering or founder generations, absolutely right. So, you discover a new ecological niche where there is hardly any competition. Your job is to occupy this niche and make it your own. So what you do is you try and have as many offspring as you can. So, huge litter. We see that with, say, lots of insects. We see that with amphibia. So there are species out there that produce huge numbers of offspring. So this is if there is a new environment or if the environment is not very stable. Because hopefully some of the offspring will survive whatever life throws at them, and they will then carry on. So if the environment is not stable, that makes sense? How much do these R strategists actually care about their offspring? Do they care about it? Not really. If you think about, a fish, for example, producing 10,000 of eggs, they don't care about it. What happens to them? As long as maybe 5 or 10 will survive, that's good enough for the species. So the caring for the offspring is usually not pronounced. What happens actually, where in the food chain are these organisms usually? Are they the top predators or the sort of the lower ones? They are the lower ones, exactly. Because so many of them get eaten, and because they don't give a damn about their babies, right? They are at risk. What is the size of these strategists? Usually, when we talk about animals, they are smaller, yeah? But they have a massive advantage because they produce so many offspring. They produce also, through recombination, they produce an incredible variety in the gene pool. And this variety in the gene pool, again, gives sort of a huge number of different genotypes that might or may not be adapted to the new environment. So let's say 99% are not adapted. You still have 1% that is ideally suited for this particular environment. So that's the R strategists. What about the Ks? They're obviously exactly the opposite. K strategists, in terms of animals, what could you imagine? Elephants, yes. Sorry? Mammals. Oh, be careful with mammals. Because, for example, mice are typical large mammals. Okay, yes. Elephants. And so tigers, whales. They are typical K strategists. Slow reproduction, but they have a stable environment. not many offspring, but the offspring that they have are very well protected and cared for. Can you see an issue, for example, with bioconservation? If you have, for example, an environment that used to be stable, but now is changing, what happens to the different strategies? What happens to the case strategists? They have a problem. They are under threat because they have only a small reproduction rate. So, for case strategists, any change in environment is a potential serious threat. What happens then if the environment changes? What happens to the R strategists? Lots will die, absolutely right. Lots will die, but some will survive, and they are adapted perfectly to the new environment. So, if an environment changes, case strategists are under severe pressure, whereas the R strategists go along and say, yee! Hey, there is a new area, let's catch that. Let's make that our own. Where are humans in that? What are humans, R or K? They are in between. Humans are in between. And that is absolutely amazing. It depends for humans, as well as for some other species, it depends on the environment again. So humans, if there is a change in the environment, they can change their reproduction rate. So they become more towards R strategists. Whereas, if the environment is stable, like for example in industrialized, so-called industrialized countries, the reproduction rate goes down, becomes even negative. So in industrialized countries, the strategy is predominantly case strategy. In environments where the situation is constantly changing, humans are predominantly R strategists. And this flexibility has made humans the sort of, I hate to say that, the dominant species on this planet, because they have the flexibility to shift. If an R strategist is put into a very stable environment, they still might be all right, but eventually they will be in fierce competition with the more suited case strategists, and the other way around. But if you are a generalist, if you are an R and a case strategist, if you are in between, you will definitely survive. Isn't it amazing what you can do with kinetics? Interestingly enough, you can even predict how these animals behave, because R strategists usually live in large groups, whereas case strategists are very often individuals or small groups. It's great, kinetics, hey? You can predict an entire ecosystem with it. That make sense? Thank you very much. Have a lovely weekend.